right, so we're back, and this in this segment we're going to talk about the relationship between money and happiness. So, on this chart, this is US data, not other countries included or anything. And you notice that the data collection starts in 1957 and it goes through on the x-axis it goes through 2005. To make it an even comparison, they did average per person after tax income, and they used the year 2000 as the basis of the valuing. So they applied the inflation calculator to those earlier years to make sure that all of these incomes are equal, right? Like we're doing it fairly, as if they were earning it in 2000. Okay, so what I want you first to notice is the blue line. And what we see is from 1957 through 2005, we have a very steep upward trend in personal income. So individuals between 1957 and 2005 had a ginormous increase in how much they were earning in a given year. So that's a big increase in income, but then look down here at the orange bar line, squiggle, and what you find is that, yeah, there's some up and there's some down on happiness, the percentage of people who are reporting that they are very happy, but it has basically hovered around 35%, basically, since 1957. It a little bit up in 1965, little bit down in 1973, but basically hovering around just about equal across that entire time. So here we have people earning 10,000 in 1957, now 28,000, 27,000 some odd dollars in 2005. You would think if money made for happiness that we'd see some change, some upward trend in this orange bar, and we're not seeing that. So it doesn't look like money alone will necessarily explain any degree of happiness that a person's experiencing. We'll talk a little bit more about that, like some nuances. But first, I wanted to, so that was US data. Now, this is international data. And so, a little bit different measure. This is called on the y axis the Subjective Well Being Index, the SWB index. Subjective. So, that's the person decided how much well being they were experiencing, right? So, it's like a self rating. Down here on the x-axis is the gross domestic product per capita in thousands of dollars in the 5 years before the survey. So we have like whole country gross domestic product. And so if the country is listed closer to the left hand, but closer to the y-axis, that means that per person, the income or the domestic product, what is produced in that economy is a lot lower. If they're over here towards the right-hand side, that means that that country has a much higher output. Their economic standing is a lot higher. So you can kind of look at some of the names of the countries over here on the left. We've got, now remember it's per capita, so per person, gross domestic product. So we see China and Vietnam and Ghana and Zambia and Uganda and Kyrgyzstan and Georgia and Belarus and Iraq and Zimbabwe, like all Guatemala, all down here towards the lowest levels of gross domestic product. Over here on the highest level, we have Switzerland, U.S., Luxembourg, Norway. A little bit farther over, we have a lot of Western European countries, Canada, Japan. Um, so so over here in the highest earning cultures versus the lowest earning cultures, we're looking to see if there's a correlation between income and then subjective well-being. And you'll notice they drew a dark black line through here to indicate sort of the curve that subjective well-being follows. That you have the lowest subjective well-being among the most impoverished countries. That's true. But once you get to a gross domestic product that's about 10 out of this scale of 30, right? This is in thousands of dollars, but I'll just call it 10 um, in 30. Once you get to about 10, there's not a lot more increase in subjective well-being across the remaining, 20 units of measurement here, right? going from $10,000 per person to $30,000 per person doesn't necessarily give us triple the subjective well-being. So that's an important thing to note also, that maybe impoverishment will be inversely related with happiness. But once you get to some critical level, it's not as important. The amount of income is not going to be the determining factor, or maybe even play a really big role in the amount of happiness that the person's experience, or in this case, subjective well-being. You'll notice it's hard to have a good measure of what we mean by happiness, so that's going to be challenging. So the rating is like a composite score, the subjective well-being index, and it's based on life satisfaction, happiness, and it compiled surveys over the previous 12 years to try and figure out the subjective well-being of the country, and 5 years of economic data for the gross domestic product. So this is a rough estimate anyway, so keep that in mind. But I would like you to note this pattern where once you get to a certain critical, in this case it's 10,000, it looks like that's as much correlation between happiness and income that we're going to see. And then once you get above that number, we're going to see stability. So that's going to come back and we're going to talk about that. Now, the thing is, you might have noticed these dotted lines that were placed around these. They try to say, oh, these are Latin American countries, these are ex-communist countries, trying to give us a little bit of pattern about, like why some countries might be placed where they're placed. One of the things that researchers have looked at is that those countries that tend to have the highest subjective well-being, regardless of income, tend to be those who have the highest free choice and the highest personal control. So that might be more important, especially in the highest subjective well-being. That might be important, an important like moderator variable that helps to explain why just earning more money doesn't make you more happy. Um, so maybe earning more money doesn't make you happy, but maybe giving it away does. Maybe having the money to be able to give it away might make you happy. Here's this study from 2008, and in the survey part of the study, they had people do self-reports of happiness, and then they did self-reports of how much money they donate to charity and other kinds of things, and they did find a positive correlation between those two things. People who reported themselves to be happier also reported themselves to have donated more money. So in survey self-reports, which of course we all know the person might not be being honest, so we have to be careful about this. But luckily, oh wait, I had one more thing to say, and then I'll tell you why that was lucky, why we're lucky. So there was no correlation between how much money the person earned and their happiness, or how much money they spent on themselves. So the only thing that emerged was this correlation between happiness and monetary donations. Then they conducted an experiment because, yes, we can't necessarily trust the self-reports, but this experiment will help us. So the participants were actually given cash as part of this experiment, and they were assigned randomly to either spend the money on themselves for some little thing that they could buy from the experiment, or spend the money on somebody else. Get something that you're going to give to, it was another participant that they would spend the money, and then the other participant got whatever they bought. And what they found is that those people who were randomly assigned to spend the money on someone else were happier afterwards than people who had been randomly assigned to spend the money on themselves. Kind of interesting. It's through this experiment, it really implies that it is the act of giving something to someone else that is in fact being associated with the happiness. Now, let's be skeptical. It's possible that the randomization didn't work and we somehow got the happier people in one group and the less happy people in the other group. I think that's a very unlikely explanation given the study. So I think more than likely what I'm reporting is probably an accurate depiction. Giving money away makes you feel better. Okay, what are some things that do correlate with happiness? What are some correlates? with happiness. So here we have happiness. High self esteem is correlated with happiness. This effect is much more pronounced in individualistic cultures where self esteem is valued more. In cultures that are more collectivistic, they don't really talk about self-esteem very much, and so the correlation's a lot weaker. They, when taking the self-esteem scales, they're not exactly even sure how to rate these concepts that they don't normally deal with. So mostly in individualistic societies, optimism and basic trust are associated with happiness. Now, remember, we've talked about Erickson's stages of development, and we're going to talk about it more in the future. But one of the big things that he claims we all develop in our first year of life is a sense of trust versus distrust for our environment. And in fact, trust is the basis for us to be able to have an optimistic outlook about the environment. If we feel like we can't trust the environment, it's going to contribute to greater pessimism. So, optimism and basic trust go together, and these are things that probably were set up in us when we were baby infants, like 0 to 12 months old, is what Erickson says. So, these are very basic orientations to the world. Um, in the big five traits of um, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, three of them actually emerge as good predictors of happiness. People who are extroverted tend to score higher on different kinds of measures of happiness. People who are more agreeable tend to, and then also people who are higher in conscientiousness. Having an internal locus of control, feeling like you are in charge of your own destiny. Now, that kind of goes along with what I was talking about in the cross cultural economic data that I provided. One of the things that seemed to be a good predictor of having higher subjective well being was having a sense that you're in control of your own outcomes. So here we are being consistent with that. Personal responsibility, believing that you do have an impact on other people and that you have um, a responsibility not to harm other people, that you have a responsibility to take care of other people, that your behaviors are a result of your actions, your choices, things like that. That's what we mean by personal responsibility. People who have more of that tend to be happier. People who have close friendships or have a satisfying marriage tend to be happier. So now we're starting to get into some of like the social support aspects that correlate with happiness. Having work and or leisure activities that engage our skills. So having the ability to sort of use what we feel like are our natural tendencies makes us happier or is associated with being happier. And then finally, having a meaningful religious faith. Not, notice the first word there, meaningful. Like some people belong and go through the motions, but they're doing it out of social pressure or guilt or other factors. Having a meaningful religious faith is associated with happiness. So, things that don't correlate with happiness, age. A lot of times when we're younger, we kind of assume that as we get older, we'll be less happy. And it turns out, no, people who are generally the amount of happy that they're going to be consistently across their lifespan. It's not associated to age. Gender or sex, not associated with degree of happiness. There are no sex differences in happiness. Education level has nothing to do with your level of happiness. A lot of times we think we'll be happier once we've got that degree, or we'll be happier once we become parents, or we would be happier if we hadn't become parents, or something. The way to happiness is to avoid parenthood. None of these are ways to happiness. These are all unrelated to happiness. Physical attractiveness. Again, the halo effect oftentimes kicks in where we look at people who are attractive and we say, I'll bet they don't have any problems. I'll bet they're happy. And it turns out they are just as plagued by the same kind of troubles. They might be different, but not probably as different as you think, the problems that they have. But physical attractiveness is not correlated with happiness. And then income is not, as long as in our culture it looks like about 75,000 or above. So as a college student, you might be thinking, well, that explains my association with income and happiness. I'm assuming that once I earn, enough to live, I'll be happier. And you probably are right on that, honestly. The above 75,000 has been questioned, like that actual number, because an economist kind of pulled it out, and I think it was 2010, and said that seems to be the cutoff. I don't know that it's 75,000. I would say, thinking back to that gross domestic product where I was talking about, there seems to be a tipping point where there's like, if you are seriously struggling and impoverished and can't provide for yourself, that every increase in income probably is going to be associated with slight increases in happiness, as you can start to maybe take a breath and not have such a struggle. Once you get to a point where you're earning enough where you can take a breath most days, you're probably starting to lose the correlation between happiness and income. And so, at the time in 2010 that this economist said it, he thought that tipping point was about $75,000, but I think that's got to be a rough estimate for the US, because there are a lot of different places where you can live where that $75,000 would still be enough, other places where that's not even close to enough. So I think it has to be relative to where you are and how, where you're living and what the economy is like, and then what it would take for that tipping point to happen where I'm no longer in this sort of impoverished. So what I've been saying is, instead of 75,000, I've been saying the poverty level. The federal government determines, how much a person needs to be earning in order to get out of the poverty level. And it changes all the time because it takes into account inflation and other kinds of things. So I'd say not being below the poverty level would be when we start to see that loss of correlation between income and happiness. All right, I think this is a really good time to stop. So we'll come back in the next video and talk about variations in happiness.